The national by-elections taking place today. Turnout for these is often marginal to low historically. But what do they suggest about voter enthusiasm or apathy? And what can we read into the results? We're joined now by the elections analyst, Wayne Sussman. Wayne, good afternoon to you. It's tempting to look at by-elections, especially when we didn't have elections for so long. This is only the second round since the start of COVID-19. It's tempting to look at by-elections and try and read all sorts of things into them. How much can we rely on the data they give us?
Thank you, Stephen. Look, there's precious little opinion polling in South Africa, so that's the first thing I want to say. And second of all, I would rather look at the trends which come out of by-elections and analyze that data than maybe hear some opinion writer who might just be sitting in their living room or sitting in their ivory tower. So yes, we've got to be cautious that turnout might be low, particularly traditionally in metros, more so than rural areas. But I do think it gives us some kind of indication and some kind of gauge what could transpire next year in the local government elections.
I mean, one of the things that's really interesting is around turnout. Now, we don't have the turnout figures for these elections yet. I'm sure it will be different, as you say, lower in metros than in rural areas. We did have a round of by-elections last month. And South Africa often seems obsessed with politics, and yet turnout in elections is getting lower and lower.
Correct. But if you compare this, by the way, from a local government standpoint, compared to many places, many countries in Europe, our turnout is still pretty high. But there were worrying trends. I'll give you an example. In Mfuleni, which is going to be one of the battleground areas in Gauteng, the ANC took a ward off the DA, which would make them, in Super Wednesday, that would make them very optimistic that things are actually going quite well on a political level, on a by-election level in Mfuleni. But if you look at the turnout, there are two other by-elections that day in the Orange Farm area, in the Everton area. The turnout was very, very low, and that is concerning. So, as I said, in metros, we expect turnouts to be low, but if in places like Mfuleni, turnout is going to be low, that is cause for concern for the ANC.
At the same time, as a sort of general political point, I would suggest that the poorer you are, the more government services matter to you. You rely more on government services. If you're rich, you can sort of buy your way out of government services. You can use private providers. But if you're poor, you would expect then that poorer people would be more engaged in politics, and so poorer areas would be more likely to see a higher turnout. Do you see that?
That could be one of the reasons. The other thing is, I think there might also be less distractions in certain of the very rural areas. So turnout is typically higher, say in the Eastern Cape in rural areas, and when the stakes are high. So in some of the Northern Cape areas where the wards are clearly defined, where it's clearly a neighborhood contest, turnout and enthusiasm might be high. But so I agree with that. In metros, sometimes the wards don't really make sense. They cover a large amount of areas. I'll give an example. There's a by-election in the city of Cape Town today, which stretches from Greenpoint to the city centre, to Woodstock, to Salt River, to parts of District 6, to parts of the waterfront. I mean, that's not really going to be a ward which has this community feel to it because it stretches over so many suburbs. So I think it might be that I agree with you that if you rely on government services, that you need to vote, that you need to make sure that you turn out to guarantee a continuation of that service. Or it could be the fact, as I said, that there's this certain wards, particularly in rural areas, have a more community feel to it.
The other thing that's sort of fascinating about it all is over the last few years, we've started to see, in some ways, perhaps smaller parties and sometimes independent candidates beginning to run. So smaller parties would include, for example, the Patriotic Alliance, which has held the balance of power on Nelson Mandela Bay in some ways. How important is this? I mean, what does this tell us about voters and their feelings towards the bigger parties?
Stephen, right now for the African National Congress, I would say their biggest concern going into the 2021 local government elections is not necessarily the big two opposition parties, which are the DA and the Economic Freedom Fighters, but rather, as we've seen in the Free State, independents who come out of the ANC. For instance, the ANC lost 10 seats on one day in the Kwakwa area in the Mluti municipality last year. And then there was an example in Sansabani, in Postmasburg in the Northern Cape, and an example in Rustenburg of another local party, which really they didn't win wards, but they took a lot of percentage off the ANC. So are we going to see examples like this in Sansabani, examples like this in Rustenburg, where they're going to say the big parties are out of touch? We can't have Kimberley deciding for Postmasburg. We can't have Johannesburg deciding for Rustenburg. Listen to us local parties, listen to us regional parties, and we can better understand your concerns and your issues and lobby for it in council. So I would say right now, going into the 2021 elections, that is going from a competitor point of view, that's the ANC's biggest concern. You use the example of the Patriotic Alliance. I would say for the Democratic Alliance, the official opposition, right now, are we seeing a trend of voters saying, Afrikaans voters saying, we like what the Democratic Alliance achieved in 2016, where we rode with them until Schweizer Reinicke in 2019, and then we got off the bus. We've also started seeing that in areas like Pakhalsdorp in George amongst working class coloured voters. We saw it in Riverlea in Johannesburg with the Patriotic Alliance winning that ward. We saw it at Al Jamar in Lenasia. Are we going to see those minority groups, let's call it the Rainbow Coalition, Musi Maimane and James Self, etc., assembled with the DA in 2016, getting off that bus and rather deciding to vote for parties which represent their cultural group, them regionally, or their race group? And that's a very big concern for the DA. So those are the two big trends I'm seeing facing and concerning the big two parties right now.
I mean, in a way, doesn't the structure of our electoral system for local elections sort of protect the ANC and the DA a little bit, because 50% of the ballot is proportional representation, and it's only 50% which comes from local wards? Is there a sort of, what I'm asking, is there a sort of ceiling as to how high these parties can go?
You use Nelson Mandela Bay as an example. Now, Marlon Daniels, I've often looked at this. The Patriotic Alliance was the party which got the last available seat. So they beat the Freedom Front for that last available seat. They snuck over the line. And they have had an outsized role on Nelson Mandela Bay politics since the 2016 elections. So I agree with you that the system, that if you have more resources, you can put up more candidates in wards, you can find better local candidates, that the system can favor you. But as you alluded to the Patriotic Alliance earlier, that you look at some municipalities in the Western Cape where single person parties, local parties, can have an outsized influence and dominate who's in government or who's in opposition for the next 5 years. So I think it's a bit of both, that the system can also favor those smaller parties.
We talk about Nelson Mandela Bay all the time because of the sort of chaos, frankly, the misgovernance that we've seen there, the arguments between political people rather than around actually improving governance. If we have more smaller parties, and you talk about the Patriotic Alliance having an outside influence, I mean, is there prospect of that happening in Johannesburg or Tshwane after these elections in November next year?
So I would say that the ANC in Gauteng and Nelson Mandela Bay, their big argument is that if you want 5 years of stability, you need to give us an outright majority. If you're the DA in the Western Cape, the Midvaal, even in Nelson Mandela Bay, some of the municipalities between Nelson Mandela Bay and the Western Cape, your argument is give us an outright mandate to govern so that small parties do not hold us to ransom. So that's the first thing I would say from a messaging perspective. If you look at the 2019 results, particularly in Tshwane, in Nelson Mandela Bay, it's very clear that next year it's likely that instead of one party winning an outright majority, it's more likely that we're going to have to see a continuation of the coalitions. And I sometimes call these coalitions of uncommon objectives. Either you're going to have to continue to work with the ANC because they're the largest party in these metros, or parties which are bitter foes, and I'd say that they even that the animus is even greater today in 2020 than it was when they formed governments in 2016, will need to find each other again, because those trends are likely to continue. Johannesburg, by the way, Stephen, might be the exception to that rule, that the ANC might find consistent smaller ideological coalition parties there in 2021 and be able to form a more stable government.
Wayne Sussman, thank you very much indeed. Really do appreciate it. Gosh, an analysis there of local government on the day in which you've been voting in by-elections.